Immigration. There is a reason why America is called the melting pot. Many different people from many different countries come to America seeking a better life. But how did we get here? Today, there are approximately 46.9 million people in the U.S. who speak another language other than English. Some of the more common languages spoken are Spanish and Mandarin. In the year 2000, there were about 7 million undocumented immigrants living in the U.S. Undocumented immigrants provide significant economic benefits to society as well. Between 30 and 50% of seasonal farm workers in California are undocumented immigrants. In the 1990s, some employers from high-tech industries were requesting expanded immigration to allow desperately needed computer programmers and software engineers into the country. In the 1980s, the Immigration Reform and Control Act was enacted. Under IRCA, who could prove that they were a continuous U.S. resident was granted legal residency. Special categories of immigrants, such as refugees, were exempt from the quota. By the end of 1995, approximately 23 million of the 260 million Americans claimed another country as their place of birth. This was the largest proportion of a foreign-born population since 1940. In the 1960s, the government reacted to the blatantly racist nationality quotas. Amendments to the Immigration Act ended those restrictions in 1965. These nationality-based quotas were replaced with an overall limitation on who would be accepted into the country. Entering the country would now be awarded on a non-discriminatory basis. In the 1940s, the largest exceptions came following World War II under the War Brides Act of 1945, when about 200,000 European refugees were allowed into the U.S. quotas based on national origins. They were as ethically and racially discriminatory as the Asian exclusions had been. These quotas favored the same Caucasian, non-Asian immigrants. On July 3, 1942, Mexico and the U.S. signed an agreement to bring Mexican men north to work in agriculture. This labor program was called the Mexican Farm Labor Agreement, or also known as the Bracero Program. The Bracero Program would offer nearly 4.5 million contracts to almost 2 million Mexican men. When the Bracero Program was terminated in 1964, a move pushed for by the United States, Mexico instituted the Border Industrialization Program. More Mexicans came over than there were program slots and were still able to find work. Many of them never went back and made America their new home. By the 1920s, the foreign and domestic policy of isolationism was the practice of American society. The citizens and many politicians were exhausted from World War II, and thus promoted massive limitations on immigration. The Immigration Act of 1924 limited the number of immigrants who would be accepted annually from any country to a small percentage of the American residents of that nationality already living in the U.S. In the 1910s, America signed a gentleman's agreement with Japan, in which the Japanese government agreed to restrict the number of Japanese agricultural laborers who immigrated from that country to the U.S. In return, the U.S. pledged to combat discrimination against Japanese residents here. A 1917 measure banned immigrants from much of Asia and required those from elsewhere to pass a literacy test. Political conservatives were officially banned the following year. In the Gilded Age, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1887 was one of the most egregious examples of the form these regulations could take, banning the immigration or naturalization of Chinese people in the U.S. for a period of 10 years. Chinese immigrants were often treated violently, and the government even supported this behavior. Anti-Chinese riots and attacks on Chinese areas were very common, and in addition, Chinese miners were often violently driven from the abandoned mines they had been working. In fact, an issue of the Alta California reported that at Rich Gulch, an area in California, 200 Chinese miners had been robbed and 4 had been murdered. Immigration continues to be a controversial issue in political debates and daily dialogues. America needs to find a balance, one that upholds our vision, cultural diversity, and the land of opportunity, and to maintain safety for all residents, citizens, documented or non-documented. It is up to us, we the people, to press our politicians to create a balance that works for all of us. But as of today, that balance has not yet been leveled.